The first thing Detective Mara Solano noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary silence of a sleeping city in the hours before dawn. That familiar quiet still carries the distant hum of refrigerators, the occasional passing car, the bark of a dog somewhere 3 streets over. This was something else entirely. This was the silence of a world that had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. She had been awake when it happened. Insomnia was an old companion of hers, something she had made peace with years ago, back when the case files stopped following her into her dreams and started waiting patiently on her kitchen table instead. At 3:06 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, she had been standing at her window with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the rain make patterns on the glass, when the city simply went still. No sound. No movement. And then, exactly 53 seconds later, the world exhaled again, minus a very specific number of people. She didn't know the number yet, that morning. She only knew that when she stepped outside into the wet street, wearing her coat over her pajamas, she found the city rearranged. Cars stopped mid-lane, their engines still running, wipers still beating against windshields now beaded with rain. A bus at the corner of 5th and Larimer sat with its doors open, its interior lit and empty, every seat vacant, every item of clothing arranged precisely where a body had been, coats draped over seat backs, shoes on the floor beneath them, wallets open in overhead netting, as if each passenger had simply evaporated from inside their layers. One child's sneaker sat in the aisle, red and muddy at the toe, separated from its pair by exactly the width of 2 small feet. Mara stood in the rain and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in moments of profound unreality, that something had broken the world. Recovered audio fragment, file 0047, a subject, Thomas Rail, 44, long-haul truck driver. Recorded 3 days after the event at a roadside medical station in rural Montana. I was on the I-90, somewhere between Billings and Missoula. Middle of nowhere, you know. Dark as the inside of a closed fist out there. I had the radio on, country station, nothing special. And then, the music it didn't stop, exactly. It's like the music was still there but something else was on top of it. Underneath it. Like, have you ever pressed your ear to a railroad track? That vibration that comes before you can hear anything? It was like that. Except it was inside me. In my chest. In my back teeth. I pulled over because my hand started shaking on the wheel. I thought I was having a heart attack. And when I looked over at the passenger seat, Danny was gone. Danny was my co-driver. His jacket was still there. His coffee thermos. His reading glasses, folded on top of his logbook. But Danny. I sat there for I don't know how long. The vibration stopped. The radio came back. And I kept looking at those glasses. Danny needed those glasses to read. Wherever he went, he can't read a damn thing. End of fragment. The official count came 4 days later, released jointly by 12 governments in a statement that tried very hard to sound measured, and failed spectacularly. Across the planet, 241,900,000 people had disappeared at precisely 3:07 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. The number was not approximate. Every government had cross-referenced data independently, and every dataset returned the same figure, to within a margin of a few thousand, accounting, they noted with careful bureaucratic delicacy, for individuals who could not be reliably tracked in existing systems. 3.07% of the global population. Gone, in 1 minute. The mathematical coincidence ricocheted around the internet within hours of the announcement, spawning thousands of threads, manifestos, conspiracy theories, and one particularly well-funded research group at MIT that dedicated itself entirely to the question of whether the percentage had been chosen, and if so, by whom. Mara read their first white paper on the train to Washington, where she had been summoned by people she had never met, to join a task force she had not applied for. The paper was 87 pages long and concluded, with admirable academic honesty, that they had no idea. She appreciated that. Recovered audio fragment, file 0091, C subject, Priya Anand, 29, jazz pianist. Recorded 6 days after the event at a hospital in Mumbai. We were mid-set. The club was full, maybe 80, 90 people. I was playing the opening chord of a Coltrane piece. I remember this exactly because the chord has this specific tension in it, it's unresolved. It's meant to want something. And right there, in the middle of that chord, the sound changed. Not the notes. The space between the notes. Like the air in the room became a different material. I felt it first in my fingers, on the keys, like the piano was vibrating on a frequency I hadn't asked it to. And then people started, they didn't fall. They didn't cry out. They just stepped back into something. Like a curtain had been opened behind them and they simply walked through it. 14 people in that room. Gone. Their drinks still on the tables, still cold, still with their lip marks on the glasses. The chord I had been playing, that unresolved chord, I couldn't stop hearing it. For days afterward. Not out loud. Inside. Like my hands still knew they hadn't finished the song. End of fragment. The task force was called Margin, which was not an acronym but a name someone had apparently chosen because it sounded serious, and it occupied a floor of a federal building in D.C. that smelled of new carpet and old anxiety. Mara was one of 11 investigators pulled from various agencies and countries. There was a woman from Interpol named Becker who never smiled and was almost certainly a genius, a former CIA analyst named Portillo who smiled too much and was also almost certainly a genius, and a young physicist from CERN named Adeyemi who wore the same gray sweater every day, and had not slept, by all appearances, since the night of the disappearance. Adeyemi was the one who first brought the clocks. It's not just the digital records, he said on their third morning together, spreading photographs across the conference table with the focused energy of someone who had found a thread and intended to pull it all the way to the end. Analog clocks. Mechanical clocks. Watches with no batteries. All of them stopped at 3:07. Not 3:06, not 3:08. Exactly. 3:07. He placed a photograph in front of Mara. A grandfather clock in the hallway of a Victorian house in Edinburgh, photographed by local police during a missing persons call. Pendulum was frozen, mid-swing. The hands read precisely. 3:07, a mechanical clock stops when there's a physical disruption, Becker said from across the table, not looking up from her own file. Shock, impact, vibration. Yes, Adeyemi said. But there were no reports of seismic activity at that time. No electromagnetic pulse. No physical event that should have caused mechanical failure at this scale. He paused. And yet, every mechanical clock within a 1-kilometer radius of a disappearance site is stopped. Clocks outside that radius are fine. Portillo leaned back in his chair. So whatever happened, it had a physical range. It had a physical signature, Adeyemi corrected carefully. Which is different. It means it wasn't a global event applied uniformly. It was local events, occurring simultaneously, distributed across the globe. Mara looked at the photograph of the clock for a long time. She had a habit of looking at evidence longer than was strictly necessary, letting it sit in her peripheral understanding before she pulled it into focus. It was something her old partner used to tease her about. You stare at things like you're waiting for them to confess, he'd said once. She'd always thought that was exactly right. Someone chose those locations, she said. The room went quiet. Or something, Adeyemi said, softly. The residue was the second thing that changed the shape of the investigation. Forensics teams working the disappearance sites had initially focused on biological trace evidence, hair, skin cells, anything that might confirm the missing persons had actually been at those locations in the moments before 3:07. What they found instead was a fine, pale dust coating every surface where a person had been. Not chalk, not ash. Something with no existing chemical classification, something that fluoresced faintly under UV light and registered unusual electromagnetic properties. The dust did not disperse normally. In open air, it settled within inches of where it had fallen. In enclosed spaces, it clung to furniture and clothing with a tenacity that confounded the forensics teams. And it was warm to the touch, not dramatically, not in a way that burned, but consistently, measurably warmer than the surrounding environment, as if it retained something. Mara took a small evidence bag of the dust with her everywhere she went during those weeks. She would hold it in her palm sometimes, feeling the faint warmth through the plastic, and think about the missing persons files stacked in the margin conference room, parents and children and teachers and strangers, all the ordinary people who had been in exactly the wrong place, or exactly the right place, at 3:07 a.m., depending on how you looked at it. The physicist at CERN who analyzed the dust sent a report that contained one line Mara memorized. This material appears to encode information at the molecular level, in a manner consistent with no known natural process. She read that sentence 15 times, and then called Adeyemi. It encodes information, she said. What does that mean, exactly? It means, he said slowly, in the careful voice of a man assembling language around something that resisted language, that the dust is not a byproduct. It's a record. It's as if whatever took these people, decided to leave behind a receipt. Acqui termina a part 1. Envio a part 2 na sequencia. 3 weeks into the investigation, Adeyemi made a request that took 6 days to approve and caused 2 senior officials to submit formal objections in writing. He wanted to reproduce the frequency. Not at full scale, not even close. What he proposed was a controlled emission of infrasound at 3.07 Hz inside a sealed chamber in the Margin facility's subbasement, using a rig of industrial transducers he had designed himself on the backs of 4 hotel napkins. The chamber was to contain no living organisms. The emission would last exactly 1 second. All recording equipment would operate remotely. We're not trying to replicate the event, he explained to the Oversight Committee, with the particular patience of someone who has already had this conversation 17 times in his head. We're trying to understand the signature. If we can reproduce the physical conditions, even partially, we can begin to understand the mechanism. The committee approved it, reluctantly, and on a Thursday morning that was cold and gray in the way that government buildings always seem to make November colder and grayer than it actually is, the team gathered in the control room 1 floor above the sealed chamber and watched the monitors. Adeyemi initiated the sequence at 9:15 a.m. For the first half-second, nothing happened. The sensors registered the frequency propagating through the chamber walls as expected. The temperature held. The air pressure held. Portillo made a quiet joke about anticlimax that nobody laughed at. Then the temperature in the chamber dropped 4 degrees in 0.3 seconds. Then every camera feed, simultaneously, went to static. Then the dust, the pale, warm, classified dust stored in a sealed container on the chamber shelf as a reference sample, the dust began to move. Not disperse. Not drift. Move, with direction. With what could only be described, in the technical report filed afterward, as intention. It migrated across the shelf surface toward the chamber wall facing magnetic north and arranged itself. This was the part of the report that caused the most consternation among the Oversight Committee, into a pattern. Not random. Not the pattern of air currents or electrostatic charge. A pattern with internal repetition. A pattern that Adeyemi, when he finally saw the post-static camera footage, looked at for a very long time before saying, quietly, to no one in particular. That's a waveform. The experiment was terminated. The chamber was sealed. 3 members of the technical team reported ringing in their ears for the following 48 hours, despite having been 1 floor above and behind 12 inches of reinforced concrete. One of them, a young technician named Pharaoh, who had been closest to the observation window, reported something else when she filed her incident form. She reported that for approximately 4 seconds during the static, she had heard music. Not from anywhere she could identify. From inside, the quiet. Mara read Pharaoh's incident report 3 times. Then she picked up the evidence bag of dust from her desk, and held it, for a long time. That night, for the first time since the investigation began, she dreamed. While Margin worked in its carpeted, classified silence, the world outside was doing what the world does when it loses 241 million people without explanation. It was falling apart, and reorganizing, and falling apart again, in the particular rhythm of civilizations confronting something they do not have the architecture to process. The economic consequences were severe but not catastrophic. Governments had feared catastrophic, had prepared contingency documents for catastrophic, and what they got instead was severe, which is in some ways harder to manage because severe does not justify emergency powers, but still breaks things in ways that take years to repair. Supply chains fractured at their 3.7% weak points. Hospitals lost staff in numbers that varied wildly by department, as if whatever had selected the missing had no preference for profession, which it didn't, which somehow made it worse. A city in northern Brazil lost its entire night shift nursing staff at 3 hospitals simultaneously. A shipping container port in Rotterdam found itself without 31 crane operators at dawn. A school in Lagos opened that morning to find that 6 of its 20 teachers had not come home. The social consequences were harder to quantify, and far stranger. Within 2 weeks of the disappearance, the first church of the threshold had appeared in Phoenix, Arizona. Within a month, there were 340 registered congregations across 28 countries, all organized around variations of the same central belief, that 3:07 a.m. was not a tragedy but a selection. That the missing had been chosen, elevated, translated, welcomed, into something the remaining population was not yet ready for. The churches held their services at 3:07 a.m. They played recordings of infrasound during worship. They wore white and left shoes at the door, because shoes were what had been left behind, and shoes had become sacred. Mara had attended one service, undercover, in a rented community hall in Silver Spring. She had stood at the back and watched 200 people close their eyes at exactly 3:07 and wait, in a silence so total and so deliberate, that she had felt, against every professional instinct she possessed, the edges of something. A frequency at the base of her sternum. A warmth in her left palm, where she had been holding the evidence bag for so many weeks that the gesture had become reflex. She had left before the service ended. She had not put the evidence bag down. The conspiracy was the thing she had not wanted to find, and found anyway. It started with a data discrepancy that Becker noticed on a Tuesday evening and brought to Mara without ceremony, the way Becker did everything, placing a single printed page on the desk and waiting. The page showed 2 numbers. The official global missing persons count, as released by the Joint Government Statement, 241,900,000. And a second number, compiled from independent demographic databases, actuarial records, and satellite census data by a team of academics in Zurich who had nothing to do with Margin and no reason to suspect their work would become significant, 242,600,000. The difference was 700,000 people. They're hiding survivors, Becker said. Mara looked at the numbers. Or they're hiding something else. It took another 3 weeks to determine what. The answer, when it came, arrived through a source Mara trusted more than any official channel, a former NSA analyst who communicated exclusively through encrypted mail and had once given her information that broke a case and ended a career, not hers. The source sent 4 words, they can still transmit. The 700,000 discrepancy was not people who had been hidden or misclassified or overlooked by the official count. They were people who had, partially gone. People who had been at the edge of a disappearance site, close enough to be affected by the 3.7 Hz signature, but not close enough to complete the transition. People who were here, but not entirely here. who existed in a kind of interference pattern between whatever this world was and whatever the other one was. They were in government facilities in 7 countries. They were alive. They were physically present. And periodically, at irregular intervals that no one had yet been able to predict, they transmitted. Not words. Not signals in any conventional sense. But the dust, the pale, warm, information-encoded dust, would form around them and arrange itself into the same waveform pattern that Adeyemi's experiment had produced in the sealed chamber. A waveform that CERN's linguists, CERN now had linguists, which was a sentence that would have been absurd 5 months ago, believed was the beginning of something decodable. Governments were not hiding this because they were malicious. They were hiding it because they did not know what to say. Because, some of the missing are still partially here and seem to be trying to send a message, is a sentence that requires a context no press office in the world had been equipped to provide. Mara drove to the facility in Virginia on a Wednesday morning, showed her credentials, and walked into a room where a 34-year-old woman named Claudette sat in a chair by a window, staring at something that wasn't in the room, with pale dust slowly accumulating around her feet in the pattern of a sound. Claudette did not speak. But when Mara sat across from her and placed the evidence bag on the table between them, Claudette turned her head, and looked at it, with an expression Mara recognized. Recognition. The dreams had started the night of Adeyemi's experiment, and they did not stop. They were not nightmares. That was the first thing Mara understood about them, and the thing that unsettled her most. They were not the dreams of a person processing trauma or fear. They were the dreams of a person, receiving a transmission. Each night, she would hold the evidence bag as she fell asleep, a habit she had stopped trying to justify or explain, and she would find herself in someone else's moment. Not the whole life, not the biography, just a single frame of ordinary existence, experienced with total sensory fidelity. A kitchen in Osaka at 2:58 a.m., a man making rice porridge for a sick child, the sound of the spoon against the pot, the smell of ginger, his specific and irreplaceable way of humming to himself without being aware of it. A fishing dock in Senegal in the middle of the night, a woman checking nets by lantern light, the cold feel of the rope through her palms, the way the harbor smelled of salt and diesel and something green and alive beneath both. A teenager in Sao Paulo, lying on a bedroom floor, listening to music through headphones, with the particular stillness of someone who has found, in a song, exactly the feeling they had been carrying alone for months. She experienced them as gifts. She also experienced them as evidence. Because the people in these moments, the man with the rice porridge, the woman with the nets, the teenager on the floor, all of them had one thing in common. She checked afterward, cross-referencing the details against the missing persons database that Margin maintained. Every single person she dreamed about, was gone. The dust was not just encoding information. It was encoding people. The residue of who they had been, the molecular record of a specific moment of being alive, preserved in something that looked like ash and behaved like memory. She brought this to Adeyemi on a morning when they were both tired in the way that people become tired not from lack of sleep but from carrying much careful attention for too long. She sat across from him and told him what she had been experiencing, without apology and without hedging, the way you tell a truth to someone you have decided to trust. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. The waveform from the experiment, he said finally. The pattern the dust made on the shelf. I've been trying to classify it as a signal. As data. As something that could be decoded with the right algorithm. And I think I've been approaching it wrong. He folded his hands on the table. Data can be decoded. But what you're describing, what you're experiencing through the dust, that's not data. Data is what you extract from something. What you're describing is what you receive from someone. Mara thought about the man humming over his pot of rice. The sound of it, the specific frequency of someone alive and unaware and ordinary, doing the thing they did at 2:58 a.m. when the rest of the world wasn't watching. They left messages, she said. Not for us, Adeyemi said carefully. I don't think they knew they were leaving anything. I think the process of transitioning, whatever the transition was, left an impression. The way a hand leaves warmth on a surface after it lifts away. He paused. The dust isn't a message. It's a handprint. 6 months after the disappearance, the world had reached a kind of equilibrium that was not peace but was the closest approximation of it that was available. People had stopped expecting an explanation. They had started, instead, expecting a continuation, the long, difficult work of rebuilding what had been fractured, accommodating the absence, learning to live in a world that was quantifiably, measurably, specifically smaller than it had been at 3:06 a.m. on that Tuesday in November. The churches of the threshold continued to grow. The warm dust remained warm, in every sealed container, in every evidence locker, in every laboratory in 7 countries. No one had explained it. The clocks had not been wound. And in the small hours of every morning, in the quiet between 3:06 and 3:08, people all over the world reported the same thing, a stillness that felt less like absence, and more like attention. Mara's last day at Margin was a Friday. She cleaned out her desk with the particular efficiency of someone who has accepted that some investigations do not end, they simply reach the limit of what can be known with the instruments available, and then they wait for better instruments or better questions or both. Adeyemi was in the conference room when she stopped to say goodbye, staring at a projection of the dust waveform on the wall, the pale luminous pattern that CERN's linguists now believed represented not a language but a kind of music, structured, intentional, built on a mathematical logic that existed in the spaces between known frequency relationships. 307 Hz, he said, without turning around. He knew it was her from the sound of her footsteps by now. You know what's interesting about that frequency? In certain acoustic models of the early universe, the models that try to reconstruct the sound of the Big Bang, 307 Hz appears as a resonance point. A frequency the universe seems to prefer. Prefer, Mara repeated. It's not a scientific term. He turned then, and looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent 6 months at the border of something vast and has decided, finally, to stop being frightened of the view. But I think it's the right one. I think 307 Hz is a frequency the universe uses the way we use a door. And I think, on a Tuesday in November, somewhere, something opened that door. And walked through it, Mara said. With 241 million people. Or invited them, he said quietly. Which is a different thing. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary rhythms. Cars and voices and the low pulse of infrastructure, all the sounds of human civilization filling the dark, that same darkness that had always been full of frequencies no one had thought to measure, until now. Mara picked up the evidence bag from the desk for the last time. The dust was still warm. It would probably always be warm. She had stopped trying to decide whether that was comforting or terrifying, and had settled, somewhere between the two, on the word sacred. She placed it gently back on the table. Left it there. Some things should not be carried indefinitely. Some things should be left, where they landed, warm and specific and waiting, like a handprint on a surface, like the chord of a song that hasn't resolved, like a reading glass folded on a logbook, in an empty truck cab, on a dark road in Montana. Like a door that doesn't need to be measured. That only needs to be walked through. Somewhere in Seoul, a girl who had heard music inside the quiet was learning, slowly, to speak again. And what she said, those around her agreed, made a strange and specific kind of sense. Not the sense of explanation or conclusion. The sense of a song that you don't fully understand, but feel, in your chest, is true. She said, they are learning our names. And in the small hours of the following morning, at 3:06 a.m., in a sealed chamber in a government facility in Virginia, the warm dust around Claudette's feet began to move. And for the first time in 6 months, it arranged itself into something new. Not a waveform. Not a pattern. A word. One word, in no language any of the linguists could identify, but that every single person in the room understood, without being able to explain how. The word was, soon. The clock stayed stopped. The dust stayed warm. And somewhere between 3:06 and 3:08, every morning, the world held its breath, not in fear, not anymore, but in the way you hold your breath when you are listening for something you have heard before, in a dream, or in a song, or in the particular silence of a world that has exhaled, and is learning, slowly, to breathe back in.